Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for your attendance, both in person and online. And also welcome to Lucas, one of our panelists who's attending a conference in Melbourne, has been kind enough to dial in. I can see him. I don't think you can yet, but so this is the third of three series of a seminar series of three, and some of you are repeat offenders coming along, which is terrific. And the previous two seminars are already available online as video recordings. They've been well accessed already, so I'd encourage you, if the desire reaches, to have a look at those. As always, I'd like to open proceedings with acknowledgement of country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we recognise the contributions of Indigenous peoples across the world to knowledge and society. I'd also like to thank again our sponsors, Moderna, IP Group and QUT, whose sponsorship has allowed us the opportunity to get some really good quality IT, including recording. And as I say, that's been accessed a lot, but it helps us reach a much broader audience than we can. It's never easy to find a time that suits everybody. So to have the content accessible outside those hours has proven to be really helpful. So thank you. So Health Translation Queensland is a partner driven organisation. We have 13 partners and you see the logos here. Enormous expertise and capability and grunt across those 13 partners. And one of them, the sort of the missions of the group is outlined in the strategic plan, which is sort of summarise it down to three aspects. One is to make the work of translational research easier. The second in the green box is to increase Queensland's translational research capability, and that's where this seminar series fits in. It's really about an upskilling type program. And then the third is to maximise the benefit of health research translation to Queenslanders and of course beyond, and that is to introduce as quickly as we can stuff that we think will have a greater impact on healthcare and to stop doing things that we now realise are not necessarily of benefit to the patient or their broader community. A couple of quick advertisements. We are in the process of establishing a clinical trials hub, which will launch in September. This will be an online interactive resource for all things related to clinical trials, including some tools and resources such as a clinical trial planner, will be assistance in budget, links to appropriate services and opportunities, including good GCP training, those sorts of things. So we firstly thank the consultation team that have put a lot of effort into the content, but we hope that this will be heavily used and it will be eminently modifiable and improvable as time goes on. So once it's launched, please look at it and tell us how it might be improved or other things that could go on it. Similarly, Health Translation Queensland is the host for the Queensland node of HESANDA, which is a national program of reusing or allowing clinical trial data to be used by others in different ways. And we'd strongly support any of you that have run clinical trials and have data somewhere to allow that data to enter the repository. Those who are running trials now, please talk to us and HESANDA team to ensure that your data goes onto this platform. All the appropriate ethics and de-identification, etc., has been sorted out behind the scenes. And of course, it's a great way to get the best bang from your buck possible from a clinical trial, in that the data you produce can be utilised, accessed and looked at by others. So just to set the scene of the seminar series, there's some observations that Queensland's got 20% of the population, and we do our bit. We contribute 20% to the GDP, but we consistently get around 12 or 13% of competitive research funding from pretty much any source, including non-government organisations you can think of. So of course the question is why, and a major reason is that we have a smaller pool of people in the field, both in university environment and in the medical research environment, compared at least to New South Wales and Victoria. And as a consequence of that, we are a little less connected nationally because we don't have as many people that we can contribute to working parties, to advisory groups, etc. There's some evidence based on scores, average scores, that our applications have been of slightly lower quality than from other places. And there's also some evidence based on co-funding, so quantitative evidence based on co-funding contributions, that Queensland applications haven't been as well supported traditionally as those from other places. there's a lot more information available in our funding analysis, which is on the website, and I'd urge you to have a look at that. But it does raise a number of questions about how we could try and address this, and part of it is has led to the development of this seminar series, which was driven by a combination of comments and requests from NHMRC, MRFF, and from industry. Particularly, I'd call out Craig Rayner from Moderna, who highlighted that he was keen for some slightly more sophisticated interactions around the place. So I thought I'd start with some very simple sort of definitions, so we're all talking about the same thing. And so what's a clinical trial? In my view, it's any activity that involves humans that tests or compares an intervention or interventions. So it's a very broad definition. A lot of people sort of think simply of, raspberry jam versus strawberry jam tested in a bunch of randomized people for a while, but I think we need to be much broader. And it could address anything, including disease prevention, screening, progression, treatment, palliation, etc. So it's not just about treatment in the classical sort of therapeutic goods sense that the federal government refers to. And that intervention could be a large number of things. And again, our definition, I think, should be as broad as possible when we start our contemplations here. It might be a drug or a device or a vaccine, etc. It could be an environmental change or a behavior change or a system change. And we should be using mechanisms to explore these things which aren't necessarily as simple as a randomization process, but we've got really good quality design capability across the state, and we should be maximizing the use of that. And then we should also be embracing the challenging areas of new technologies, gene therapy, mitochondrial manipulation, to name a couple. There are things that we should be contributing and could be contributing to the trialing of some of these interventions. And from that, then there's a trialist set of obligations. It's not quite the 10 commandments, but it's a series of things that I think are recognized in the field that I think it's worth highlighting, trying certainly not to teach you to suck eggs. But firstly, it's an obligation to design a scientifically based and ethically sound study. Then to follow accepted processes, where there's often an omission here, as in the appropriate preclinical toxicity and other things that one should do routinely before a human is exposed to your intervention. That's particularly applicable, of course, to drugs, vaccines, etc., devices. Gain the necessary approvals and ensure adequate funding to not just start the trial, but to complete the trial. Because if you start a trial, enroll patients, and then cannot continue the trial, that is not ethically appropriate. You should register the study with the appropriate bodies and publish the protocol. And if you think all that's a no-brainer, then MRFF and NHMRC have had a look at the last $100 million that they have spent supporting clinical trials, and half of those studies did not publish their protocol or enroll a patient. So this should be not negotiable, but clearly it is. And to be fair to both MRFF and NHMRC, they, in consultation with their expert working groups, have really thinking about some clever ways to address some of this, including stage-gated funding, etc. And some of you might have been here for our first in the seminar series, where they talked a little bit about some of those approaches. Then, of course, you've got to do the work, enroll the patients, study. Monitoring is very important. It's often underdone, particularly in investigator-initiated studies, and that may or may not include recruiting or coercing some of your non-conflicted friends or acquaintances into forming an independent data safety monitoring committee. Then, of course, analysis with the science, with rigorous science as you can possibly do, and publication, and then the work to implement the findings. So even if the findings of your trial is not as you anticipated, you have an obligation to ensure that those findings are implemented, disseminated and implemented. So that's the preamble. Again, a quick advertisement, a couple of things that are upcoming. We've got an introduction to consumer and community involvement in health research in August. And our big event for the year historically is the National Research Ethics Conference, which is 5th. We routinely now are getting registrants in the thousands for this. It's a terrific event, and I would encourage you to have a bit more of a look at these on our website. Similarly, I would strongly encourage you to all consider nomination for the new program of committees, or for the joint NHMRC MRFF advisory committees and principal committees. Both MRFF and NHMRC are open about the fact that they don't get as many applicants from Queensland as they would like for these committees, They are committed to having 20% representation from Queensland on those committees in line with population as they are with the other states. So I would urge you to put in an application. It's not a particularly onerous task. It's a 2-page CV using their pro forma, which is not difficult. And you need a couple of people to vouch for the fact that you're an upstanding citizen, and that shouldn't be too hard for anybody here. And you can nominate the committee or committees that you would be particularly interested in being part of. And of course, particularly the Consumer Advisory Group and the Industry Philanthropy Commercialisation Committee, they do not require an enormous academic track record. And in fact, they're keen for people that bring other perspectives into those committees. So now the format is the same for this event as the previous ones. We've got a panel of 3 in the room and Lucas online. It will be a pure Q&A format, both from in the room and online. I will moderate. We want it to be informal. If things start to get a little bit too specific, I might sort of step in and say, well, you know, we can have that conversation offline, because we want as much of the discussion to be of interest to as broader audience as possible. I'll do a quick introduction, and risk of embarrassing our colleagues. We've got a terrific panel of very broad sort of church of representation. So in no particular order, we've got Nick Swire, who's Executive Dean of Health Science and Medicine at Bond. Nick's a GP, and he's a director on the Gold Coast Hospital Health Service. So he's got a huge experience across a span of healthcare delivery programs. And he's got a very long and prestigious track record in clinical trials in primary care. And I was very keen to get a primary care sort of take on some of the challenges and difficulties and opportunities. So thanks very much, Nick, for coming along. Nadine Foster, who's Academic Director of UQ's Clinical Trial Centre. Again, huge experience, particularly in the UK, of running clinical trial centres, and brings an international perspective. So thanks, Nadine. And Nadine's also involved at the STAR clinical facility and as a clinician, so brings that dual perspective. Lucas Latuka, who's online, you'll see in a minute, is Director of the Clinical Trial Centre at the University of Sunshine Coast, which is a really high-performing centre. It's got 5 facilities. Sorry, it's got 5 different facilities, including one at South Bank here in Brisbane. Growing fast, some phase 1 studies. Soon we'll have overnight capability. So Lucas brings a huge experience interstate as well as Queensland to this. So it's great to have him here to be talking about really the pros and cons of running an efficient and commercially viable over a period of time unit. And last but certainly not least, Kay Hewson is here. And Kay is, I think, a substantive home, has been in Queensland Health for a while, but she's now the director of the Australian Teletrials program, which was an MRFF funded to the tune of 75 million, if I remember correctly, program to try and encourage, facilitate, design, implement, do everything for teletrials with a clearly national perspective. And that again will be a new perspective for many of us to think about how to run a trial where the person is not sitting in your consultation room or in your individual facility. So I'd ask Kay and Nadine and Nick to come up to the stage, and Lucas, if we can get you in somehow, that would be great. Thank you. Lucas. Lucas, can you see us and hear us?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much. And I've got some people in the audience that will throw things at me if I forget that you're up on the screen behind me. So the floor is open for questions. But before that, I have asked all of the panelists to open proceedings with 3 or 4 hot tips that are crucial for successful running. Better. Sorry. So I've asked the panelists all to present 3 or 4 hot tips of things that they feel are crucial for clinical trials, things that we should not do, perhaps things that they wish they'd known 10 or 5 years or 20 years earlier in their career, to share with us to try and make our participation in clinical trials easier. So Lucas, I might start with you as the online person. What are your tips of the trade?
Thanks, John. Hopefully you can hear me clearly.
Yep.
Look, where I'd probably like to start is probably to sort of outline that whether you're looking at commercial or academic projects, I believe there's more common than there are differences between these camps, and often they're divided. So although our work and some of my views often reference commercial studies, I would urge all of us to see the commonalities rather than the differences between the nature of these projects and where they're conducted, particularly when thinking about some of the operational needs and priorities. So in our environment, we do almost exclusively commercial sponsor-led projects for industry. But I think a lot of the learnings over time could easily translate to academic and investor-led projects. I guess some of the things that I'd like to highlight, and all of us have probably had that relentless focus on GCP or good clinical practice, but I would suggest equally important is the notion of good business practices, which revolve around aspects around financial management, sustainable resource management, getting the terms of trade right with your external stakeholders and funders. In some cases, there's not much to negotiate when it's a government funding body, but certainly when working with commercial sponsors, getting the terms of trade, the business-to-business contracting right is particularly important. Scenario planning and having well thought out contingencies should things go better than expected or unexpectedly, and having a good sense around that risk and reward considerations. And I know some of the topics you'd like us to discuss is where we can find efficiency gains. So I think there's probably lots to discuss around where efficiencies can be realized within a clinical trial operation. So, I think for me, it's highlighting that hand in hand, it's not just the intuitive things around good clinical practice, it's also getting the business of clinical trials right, not just for a single project, but more broadly around the operation of any clinical trial environment. So that's probably where I'd sort of make my initial contributions to this forum.
Thanks very much, Lucas. That's terrific. Okay.
I guess I come at it from a different perspective, obviously running a national program, and the point of the MRFF grant is to build infrastructure for sites to conduct clinical trials in regional, rural and remote areas of Australia. So it's a different challenge. We want to support all of what Lucas has just said, but we do it through having an expert workforce in the form of a regional clinical trial coordinating centre. So I guess what I've learnt from them is that they supplement then where there is a lack of capacity at sites. So if you are considering a clinical trial, particularly in Queensland, but this is across the country, is to actually contact them early on to work through what it is that you're actually trying to achieve through your clinical trial. If it's a commercial sponsor, they'll be the conduit. If it's a collaborative group of investigators, then they will help to make sure that there's a whole fit for purpose process going on in the background. That's my first one. My second one is really about the protocol. So teletrials is, it's not just about straight to the patient, it's actually primary satellite sites. So the primary, which is the coordinating centre, supports satellite sites, which are the local centres to the patient, as close to home as the patient can be, so that they have equal access to new interventions wherever they live. That only works if there is good communication between the primary and the satellite site. So yes, the tele part comes in there because it's telecommunication, but it's actually about relationship building as well and trust. And so in that relationship, the processes that then take place come under a supervision plan. So we have developed a national supervision plan to basically look at that in terms of roles and responsibility, and that's a resource on our website. The reason I talk about that is because I think it's a good guideline essentially for not only the program, but for thinking about your site capability when you do introduce a clinical trial. And I guess my third one is really around governance. So the thing I hear from all 6 jurisdictions that are on the program is governance takes for a long time. It's the thing that holds us up. You know, we're looking at streamlining. It's now written into the Queensland Health Research Strategy. It's come out of our Queensland Clinical Centre as being a priority recommendation. The time has got to stop where we start keep talking about it and how frustrating it is. We actually need to do something about it. There are certain things going on in the Office of Research and Innovation to hopefully address that. But from a practical sense, it's really knowing for that site-specific assessment what is going to be done at that site, and early on having contact with the research governance officer to actually look through at what's going to be required. And that can be done through a meeting, so that you have everything in place rather than have that back and forwardness of taking time up and then have a surprise. And then, you know, the next thing we know, it's taken 12 months. And, you know, I have that experience. We just set up our first diabetic commercial sponsored clinical trial in Roma. Took 12 months, but did we celebrate at the end of that?
That's great. Thanks, Nadine.
So I thought I'd focus on this issue of getting funding for clinical trials. And I guess my 2 key points are, firstly, the way we do trials needs to improve. And then secondly, we need to develop excellence through critical mass. So in terms of the way we do trials needs to improve, I just am spotting the change, I guess, globally, but also in Australia, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic, that really funders are wanting more efficient trials. We need to get results faster, and we need to do our trials in a way that more reassures funders that we will succeed. We'll be able to answer the question we set, and we will succeed by getting the results translated into practice. I'm led to believe that in one of the recent funding rounds of NHMRC, around 27% of the trials funded were adaptive in some way. And so I think the design of the trials that we're doing also needs to be more innovative. And I think there's a great appetite at the moment for smarter designs that make best use of resources, including the funders' funding envelope for trials. So how do we design trials that are more efficient, that we can do in ways that lower the total costs for the questions that we're asking and achieve greater value for funders? And I think there's huge potential, particularly in interest around adaptive platform trials. These trials, of course, require new expertise, and that feeds nicely into my second point, which is critical mass. We need large interdisciplinary teams that bring together complementary knowledge and skills. So developing trial teams with the right areas of expertise, the methodologists like statisticians and health economists, the trial managers as part of our development teams who bring real expertise in the delivery of complex clinical trials and the feasibility of clinical trials, the database developers, the consumers and people with lived experience, the clinicians, the researchers at different levels, all working together with systems that support us. A quality management system for trials, standard operating procedures, so we're not all reinventing wheels. All of that's needed and coming together, I guess, in critical mass to get funding for high quality clinical trials in Queensland. And that reassures funders that their dollars will be well placed with trials that are led out of Queensland in strong collaborative and interdisciplinary teams.
Thanks, Nadine. Nick?
Yeah, well, I'm really glad that John opened with a very broad definition of clinical trials because, I mean, as someone who does trials in the primary care setting, and that's primarily in general practice setting, most of the things that we might test are models of care. Often it's a different sharing of responsibility. It might be about use of digital devices or wearable technologies. It might be about better diagnostic processes or screening processes. And I noticed that a lot of the clinical trials sort of language tends to go to as if it's a test or a drug or device. And that's kind of buried in a lot of the sort of assumptions around clinical trials. So that makes it a little bit sort of tricky when you're someone who does health service sort of interventions. but does them in a randomized design and, and uses things like cluster randomization, etc. So I think that's important. And another thing that for the general practice setting where I work is there is no infrastructure, basically. We have general practitioners working in their communities. They don't have any funding that's directed towards engagement in research, and they don't have a lot of research sophistication. They may be interested, they may see it as an helping and valuable for their patients, and they'd like to participate in some way or contribute, but their capacity is very limited by all the other things they have to do in their day. And one of the things I think that is important is really understanding that and understanding what they can do in that context and not overburdening them and trying to make it as easy as possible for them to participate. And that goes back to the point about relationships, which I think came up earlier. You really have to develop that relationship of trust, and that they can trust that if you're engaging in the project that an academic like me is leading, they're not going to have a horrible experience. We hope they're not going to have, it won't cost them too much money, it won't cost them too much time, and they will get some feedback. They will get something that acknowledges that, this was interesting, this contributed in some way. So I think that sort of relationship has to be very carefully respected and managed and fostered over time, and just understanding their context. I think the next point is about the team that can do that, and that interdisciplinary team that has the range of skills you need to conduct the project. And I think your point's absolutely right, that we need to be better at building those teams and realising who we need to have there. The biostatistician, the health economist, the translational person, the person with content knowledge, and how those teams can work together effectively and communicate well is crucial to, I think, success in doing your trial. If you can't communicate well amongst your team, if you don't have the governance set up, you don't have the systems of communicating with each other and the broader reference group you might have of advisors or consumers that you work with, I think that can lead to problems, and almost always does. And I guess and it sort of goes to the funding thing as well. I think people sometimes are overambitious in the sort of investigator-led work that I see, and a lot of trials in primary care, the main problem that happens is they do not recruit the number of patients that they set out to recruit, so that they're consistently, unfortunately, underpowered for their outcome. And I've been guilty of that as well. And it's not through lack of trying. Sometimes it's by being being too ambitious, or not following that maximum of research that everything that can go wrong will go wrong. Because, it does. And you just have to be really thoughtful about what you would need to do to achieve your recruitment targets and actually then deliver something that's valuable. And so that data you showed, John, from the NHMRC and MRFF is food for thought, isn't it? About how many studies do not manage to recruit and deliver. And the public money that's going in there is a concern. So that'd be my three, I think, from my personal view.
Thanks very much. That's great. And it's, I think, a really interesting observation that in the 3 seminars we've had now, the absolutely consistent theme from NHMRC, MRFF and venture capital in the first, industry in the second, and now is the development of relationships. And it's just across all areas, and it's that's the takeaway perhaps, which is great. So the floor is open for questions. Perhaps while we're waiting, Lucas, could I ask you one, which is, having visited your sites now and been very impressed, one of the impressive things was that the investigators that you have found a lot of value in being investigators on the industry-sponsored trials that might be particularly focused on trials in their clinical area of interest, for example, but they've also been able to learn new skills. And perhaps could you talk about the advantages and the disadvantages of lining up to be an investigator in these studies?
Sure, thanks, John. And probably to extend in terms of Nick's experiences working in primary care, we found our place initially working in the primary care environment by partnering with GP clinics and then progressively moving towards the urgent care setting, which is a relatively new health setting in not just Queensland, but Australia. The composition of our investigator team is largely GPs that had never seen or touched a clinical trial throughout their careers, and we provided the platform and the opportunity for them to come and experience clinical trials, to be mentored and trained and upskilled to transfer some of their clinical skills into the clinical trial environment. And so we've had GPs that have taken up clinical trials for 1 or 2 days a week and progressively have converted their full-time commitment towards clinical trials. And we so far have, I think, about 14 GPs that work almost all full-time for us across our various clinical trial sites. And they're involved in clinical trials looking at various things, including chronic disease management and investigating new and emerging therapeutics in those indications. I think what they've highlighted to us about their experiences in the early stages and what keeps them in clinical trials is they are retaining quite a lot of their clinical skills. They do enjoy the patient interface, which they have routinely each and every day. What they're not prepared for is some of the rigor around data collection and the oversight that occurs in and around clinical trials. So they're probably not used to having someone look over their shoulder every day and pull them up on inconsistencies or variations in the data that sometimes are documented or transcribed incorrectly. But what they do enjoy is they enjoy the team approach. They enjoy the fact that there's a multidisciplinary team and resources that go into conducting the clinical trial protocols, so they don't feel like they're working alone in isolation. They do like the pressure. They like the speed, the activity, the variation in projects, the interactions between sponsors, ethics committees, and other stakeholders. And they like first and foremost the fact that they get the opportunity to access these therapies and participate at a professional level in the conduct of clinical trials. So they're part of something global, and that's something that typically I think a GP is not offered at any point in their career or their profession to be involved in clinical trials, undertaking these type of R&D activities. Often it is the domain of tertiary hospitals and specialists that have spent quite a considerable time in their careers, I guess, attaining that status to be invited to be a PI or a sub-investigator in a trial. So for our GP colleagues, I think we're seeing lots of rewards and lots of satisfaction in their involvement in clinical trials. And again, I sort of speak to this from a commercial clinical trial perspective, but certainly some of the observations they've also made is their colleagues have a sense of trepidation with these sponsored clinical trials because of the sort of wariness of big pharma and whether you're actually conducting legitimate research. And once you get that sort of line of sight and exposure of the nature of the work we do, it's pretty clear that the work is fairly robust. It's independently conducted, and there's a lot of attention to detail and rigor involved in the work. So I think that's part of the satisfaction, knowing that the work is of a high standard and high quality.
Thanks, Lucas. Have any questions or one online? Okay.
Online, somebody saying that science background trial coordinators are well equipped to deal with paperwork and the monitoring and oversight that goes with it.
Okay, good point.
You mentioned that it's important that we can give the funding bodies confidence that we will actually undertake the trial and we will do it properly. When you're applying for funding, what's your advice on the best way to do this, particularly if going forward they are going to start being a little bit more careful about who they fund and how they fund to make sure that the funds are used properly?
Well, I mean, I might preface that from just drawing on my experience from the UK. In the UK, the main large clinical trial funder is the health technology programme. And really these days, you won't get a clinical trial funded unless you've already conducted feasibility and pilot work that is randomised, if you're going for a randomised main trial, and to demonstrate in more than one site that you can actually recruit, that you can engage the clinicians, develop those relationships, that your approach to patient identification, screening and recruitment is working sufficiently well. So that hasn't quite happened here in Australia, and there isn't an obvious funder for pilot and feasibility trials, and I really think that's a gap in Australia. And of course, those of us who are here and trying to do that are using other means to try to get pilot and feasibility work done in order to then provide reassurance for a main trial funder that their dollars would be well placed. And hospital foundations and charities, of course, are filling that gap as far as I can see in Australia at the moment. The other thing that I think has changed a lot is the explicit intention to not just promise the earth, as Nick might say, and then deliver and under-deliver, but instead to build in clear interim analyses points. The language has shifted to from external pilot trials to now internal pilot trials in the UK, and the HTA are increasingly funding, let's say, Nick and I to do a large trial that is multi-centre, but there's a clear stopping and interim analysis point whereby if we are not succeeding, we won't continue. And that taxpayers' funding is reallocated in different ways. And then the other observation from the UK coming here is the monitoring. So we talk about monitoring within the trial, but I'm talking about a monitoring relationship between the funder and the trial team. My trials in the UK, we submitted monthly progress reports on recruitment. And we had meetings with program managers if our recruitment was going significantly under our anticipated numbers. There's nothing like that in Australia. And so what tends to happen here is we all do our very best, but reach the end of the trial timeline and realize that we are seriously under delivering. So I think there's lots that could change in the Australian landscape over time, and maybe some of these new committees that MRFF and NHMRC are putting together may look at international examples of where you can evidence better that a trial is feasible by doing good pilot and feasibility work that is funded. And where you can build in formal analyses points to allow you to really get some eyes over whether you're headed in the right direction and whether other mitigation needs earlier action than perhaps what I'm seeing here in Australia.
I'll throw to you in a second, Nick, but I can tell you what some of the things that MRFF are seriously contemplating is, as I mentioned, a stage-gated funding, so a longer total duration of potential funding. So that's a problem now, especially, as Nick could speak to this, I'm sure, but for a lot of studies, a 3-year or a 4-year grant timeline is not, just doesn't fit the ticket. But a stage gated, so, you will be guaranteed funding for your entire study, but you must meet the milestones. And so we need to start preparing for that in the way we write our grant applications, to say that we will have a pilot, we will test whether we can recruit specifically in the patient population of interest. And if we can't, then we recognise you're not going to continue to throw money at us. With exactly as Nadine said, the MRFF view is that, you're not going to be penalised for failure, but you're not going to be continually given taxpayers funding for stuff that is obviously not going to meet the milestones. Nick, do you have any additional?
Yeah, look, I think you do need to try to demonstrate in your funding application, you need to demonstrate that you've had experience and success previously. And that's always the problem. How do you get that unless someone gives you a chance first up? And that's very difficult. But if you can show examples of, where you've done something that's similar before and you've been able to recruit, then obviously that gives the funder confidence that you could do it again. And that's got to be relevant to the trial, of course. But if, for example, you're inviting patients to participate in the study in a previous trial, you had a 30% uptake or something, you could say, well, maybe that would go across to this study. Or you've managed to recruit 40 practices before in my scenario for a study, and you're saying we want to get 35 or something. We've shown we can do it. Here are our networks. Here is who's supporting us. It's all got to be real, you can't just say that and it not be real. It's got to be real. And I completely agree that we really lack that funding for feasibility, testing interventions, seeing whether they're feasible, whether they work, whether they appeal to practitioners, whether they actually address the issue. And we are in great need of that. And the little bits of funding that are around for that are so competitive because everyone's chasing them.
Yeah.
Everyone's chasing that hospital foundation, or the College of GPs has a foundation grant, or things from the private health funds. And it is a real problem that we don't have a funding landscape that supports that.
Thanks. Any other questions? We've got a couple. Ingrid, and then Kate with one up the back too. Ingrid, go.
Yeah, Ingrid Hickman from UQ. We've heard already today mentions about partnerships and relationship building and how people involved in clinical trials get professional satisfaction from being part of a team. We also know when we apply for funding, we need to show clearly the interdisciplinary team that we've created. So I'm really interested to hear from the panel members some practical tips for that they've experienced or they've used for establishing and sustaining successful interdisciplinary teams for clinical trial delivery, and that we can perhaps learn from in our own practice to bring successful teams together. What's the ingredients for successful interdisciplinary clinical trial teams?
Hey, you must be looking at this from the almost the funder's perspective. What are the bits and pieces you're putting together in Roma or in Rockhampton or in Broken Hill?
It's a little bit different again. I mean, my overview of the regional clinical trial coordinator centres in each jurisdiction, 2.5 years on, I can see success in a couple of jurisdictions over others because of the makeup of that team. But that's, they're the coordinating team, right? So they're supplementing or going in or supporting those sites to build up the capacity at those sites. I guess the value of the model of teletrials is that having a primary and a satellite site, the idea of that supervision is to build up the satellite site with that interdisciplinary team and to give that peer support as well. So, a primary investigator at a primary site may be a clinician, doctor, but it could be a CNC at the satellite site. And that's the diabetic model I just explained before, where, that person has dual function as well. They're the diabetic nurse, they're also the educator, but now they're part of the clinical trial delivery as well. And by being in a smaller site, they've now included their pathology team and their more sort of local teletrial coordinator as well. So it's kind of like building that idea of giving something, a little bit of a carrot to then build around it to say, okay, well, we'll start you off and we'll support and you bring in the people that are interested at your site. But I also support what Nadine said before about that multidiscipline. We approach these things in a more sort of, a scientific way, but all of those other elements of planning the research, the clinical trial to ensure that we have good evaluation and the economics behind it and the data collection. I think they're a lot missing at the beginning, and then as we see time grow on, they're the elements we're coming in the back end of trying to then pull together to make our case to get that translation into the clinical practice. And I think it's the planning at the beginning of the skill set that is really the key here.
I would say value your team members. It's not just the CIA who has a great idea. The person handling the data, the person at site who can see how to run that site more efficiently. So I guess it's about valuing your team, and that pulls through into how you cost up your trial. So you can't say you value your statistician whenever you fund them at $20,000, which, quite frankly, they're going to cost $150,000 or $200,000. I think placing real value genuinely in the interdisciplinary team and the way their complementary skills come together around a trial, I think is really important. And allowing that then to permeate how you go about doing your trial management group meetings and ensuring that everyone has a voice is a good start. Yeah.
Lucas, you alluded to some efficiencies, and I think you were suggesting maybe that there could be some collaboration across centres, and some of the teams that Ingrid's, I think, referring to here might be, for example, a health economist, and there's not a lot of them around necessarily. Do you think there's an opportunity for us to look at some of those non-CIA but absolutely crucial components of the team, that we could share them or somehow figure out a way to use them across centres or between centres?
Absolutely. And I think for us, the big turning point was when we started to plan operationally beyond a single project, and we started to look at the broader resource management across our trial infrastructure and teams. I think we focused on going beyond our immediate workplace and partnering with externals, externals being GPs, private specialists, and key opinion leaders in various areas. And so we did so by convincing the university legal team to put in place the type of agreements that allowed us to flexibly work and bring in expertise that was lacking across our team. And over time, once we covered off a few successful studies, it gave us the ability to build up functional teams. And those functional teams, be it quality, be it data management, be it clinical teams or other, we've managed to maintain those teams by planning and conducting the right feasibility assessments each and every time before projects start. And this allows us to assess the feasibility of a project, but also to eliminate projects that are simply not viable. And sometimes, although we're wanting to do work, it's important to determine whether that project will be viable or not, or whether it will send us into a financial position that disadvantages the whole operation, and that in a clinical trial context is not uncommon. It's a roller coaster of experiences in any given year when you're juggling multiple clinical trial projects, making sure that they're all operating viably at any given point in time. But the turning point for us was when we started to create critical mass with our functional teams to support our growth and scalability in our operations to do more trials and also do them in more locations, not just at a single site.
Yep, thanks. Got a question up the back?
Thank you. My question is about natural experiments. Natural experiments are not considered clinical trials, but they do not require any funding, and it probably is more effective and results more useful for several reasons. So should we not be spending more effort in trying to analyze the results of natural experiments which are going on all the time? Thank you.
Great question. And I guess a part of that would be called observational studies as opposed to a clinical trial type approach, but the machinery, I think, is very much the same. And so anyone want to tackle that?
I would love to know what natural experiments don't require any funding if you're going to run alongside it to evaluate it. Yep. In my experience, it always requires funding. But maybe you can help me later understand what kind of natural experiments you mean that don't require any evaluation costs. Yeah.
I guess my comment would be how could one create the team and the funding and the ethics and all of that to actually capitalize on things that happen. I mean, COVID, a whole lot of things we learned from COVID, but it came along. We perhaps should have known it was coming, and people did tell us things like something like was going to come, but we still weren't ready. So, how would you have an ecosystem that was ready to capitalize, I guess, and funding would come into that, an ethics system that worked for it, and then how you capture the data in a valid and reliable way. They'd be some of the challenges. But I think the question is right. We probably are not sufficiently thinking about, well, where are the learnings from things that happen in the world, and how do we capture that in a rigorous way?
Well, there was a lot of funding come into Queensland for a variety of studies looking at the impact of the Queensland floods, of course. So that is one example. But to take your point, Nadine, that was required significant funding application processes, etc. But we do have huge data that's collected, particularly from our inpatient stock, that is collected routinely in the electronic medical record. It's searchable. So there is an opportunity that we could access that data and look at regional variations in X or Y, etc. Whether there's fluoride in the water in this town versus that town, to raise a controversial one. But so to take your point, that's probably something that we should be thinking about a little bit more seriously. I think it's a really good question. Katrina, got a question online? Yeah.
What are some of the things that the Queensland Health Research and Innovation and Health Translation Queensland are doing to look at streamlining governance process?
So the question directly to Kay was, how are we streamlining governance? So to give a quick bit of history, which most of you will know, traditionally the time-related roadblock was ethics. That's been very significantly addressed. It's much better than it was, and governance is now sort of the problem, and including site-specific approval, which I always think of sort of separately, even though they're treated in an overlapping way. So
it's a very good question. I'm so glad you asked me. So, as I said, the Queensland Senate came out last year with their recommendations, and in addition to that, our research strategy for Queensland Health was launched this year. Those two parts out of action plans were the prime things that people asked for and consulted on. So how are we addressing it? Well, one, we're actually looking at some directions to the health services to help them to look at their practices. We have a community of practice around our research governance officers, of which the Queensland Clinical Trial Unit coordinate with them. And that's always about education, I guess empowering that workforce as well. And also, I guess, and when I say empowering, allowing them to look at what they should be looking at in terms of governance, and not allowing the creep that we've seen, particularly in teletrials, to go what's looked at by the ethics committee as well. And that was quite a surprise to me when I started hearing about it. You know, ethics is about protocol and safety of patients, and then the others about the site. Well, they've sort of crossed over, which is partly why we developed this supervision plan as well. That was both meant to be, ethics committees were asking for more information about teletrials, and then governance was covering across. So we thought if we had a national approach to, this is what we mean, this is what this site will do, this is the capability of this site, these are the roles, these are the CVs, this is the cost, etc., then it would start to give people confidence in the process to then hopefully have a more fluid and efficient process through. I guess the other part is just from a national perspective as well. We're working with ACTA, and ACTA at the moment are conducting some...
sorry, that's the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I've become an acronym-friendly person. And that they are actually interviewing research and ethics officers to kind of look at that, so what education we can target to it as well. And we held, Australian Teletrials Program actually held a national workshop last year on research governance as well. And we've just finalised our report of recommendations as well. And one of the aspects, again, was the workforce of where research governance officers come from and how they're trained. And it was kind of highlighted, essentially underdone. And often those research governance officers will have more than one job in the smaller places and facilities. And it also comes down to the relationships, again, within that organisation between the research director of research, the chief exec, the numbers of people that have to sign off or don't understand. So there's a whole education program here. And one of the really fundamental things going forward, apart from trying to support with guidelines and directives and stuff like that, is actually having a concierge service within Queensland Health in our office that will then be manned as a, I guess, phone a friend kind of approach as well. So we can start to support people through if they're new to it, or if they've come up with an issue, or like even navigating the ERM systems and the other systems that will come as part of the one-stop shop as well. So there's a lot going on. There's not one thing, but it's definitely, if the time is right to do something, it is now. And we know from our commercial sponsors as well, if we want to be the clinical trial place to come and have that investment, that is their number one thing as well that we have to address. So we have lots of support to do something about it. So we are.
Great.
Oh, sorry.
Brian, question?
Hi, Brian Gabrielli, Marta Research. I was interested in your idea about how we need to be clever with trial design and, be more cost effective, because I'm in the midst of writing a trial now and the costs are just enormous. So where can we be clever?
Well, the reason why I mentioned in particular adaptive trials, and even within the broad heading of adaptive trials, specifically adaptive platform trials, and of course we've seen the MRFF Act with their new call just for registry nested trials and adaptive platform trials. So I think Australia is starting to move in this direction. So the idea there is that instead of needing yet another $2 million to do yet another trial that this time compares 2 other models of care or 2 other drugs or 2 other devices for the same condition, the big shift in thinking with adaptive platform trials, of course, is that those trials are condition focused, not treatment focused. So instead of having to set up yet another new trial from scratch in another 20 centres, this time on the same patient group, but this time comparing 2 different drugs, that instead you set up a platform, and the money that goes into setting up that platform, of course, is significant, but the platform, rather like a train, keeps going on the tracks, and some treatments can come off and other treatments be added. And we saw the power of that kind of adaptive platform trial during COVID. And I think lots of countries are really keen to see how we maximize efficiency in using that type of design wherever possible and wherever it's suitable. It's not suitable for all things. But that's one such example, and that's why I specifically mentioned it. And I can see Australia's beginning to go, oh, we could do more in this space, and MRFF in particular wanting to fund some pilot and feasibility work around that type of trial design, and then some of these full platforms, as we might call them.
Thanks. Do we have one last? You get to be last, I think.
Okay, thank you. Is there any possibilities for the funding if the clinical trial centers outside Australia? I mean, let's say Indonesia, we have a new clinical trial centers, and we are looking for the funding from Australia. Thank you.
I think both NHMRC and MRFF don't fund investigator trials outside the country, is my understanding, but certainly some of the charities would, I think, be interested, especially where there are conditions affecting populations of both countries, and of course there are many. So I can't directly answer your question, but we're happy to take that offline and get back to you, get some more information. Yeah.
I mean, there are international collaborative schemes for trials that Australia are already partnering on with Canada, with the UK, for example. So with the Canadian Institute of Health Research, Canada, and the National Institute of Health Research in the UK, Australia do offer purposeful collaborative trial grants where, for example, there could be a clinical trial centre in the UK being the central management team. And now we're adding sites and participants from Australia, and there's an Australian funder that will help us do that. But, you know, all these schemes have certain guidelines, and in particular, you know, I'm very aware that they won't fund CI time outside of Australia in some of these schemes, which is a tricky challenge to overcome. But you can certainly have trials that are running from Australia with international sites, and some of the funding from funding envelopes here can be used to support those international sites. So some of that is possible here, as far as I can see.
Nick, did you?
Yeah, well, I'm involved in one between Canada and Australia with that on low back pain, and there's a similar intervention. It's not exactly the same, being tested in Canada and in the Australian context, about having a musculoskeletal therapist as the first point of call for someone with acute low back pain. It's interesting to contrast, though, how the different sort of health systems influence how you conduct that study across the two sites, and how different even Australia and Canada are in how our health systems work. But, you know, there's an example where, and that was an international trials collaboration, I think, funding. So it was jointly funded between Canada and Australia.
Okay, well, I think we're at time. Oh, we've got one more. Sorry.
Ask, is there, I suppose, I don't know if this is exactly adaptive, but an efficient a way to be more efficient with funding is to have trials piggybacking on each other, if it's possible to do that based on study design or potentially related study questions. Are there any sort of resources or databases in Australia that would facilitate something like that?
I'm not aware of any in Australia. And just the other day, I was looking at what's available in Australia to find trials. So if any of us, even as wearing our lived experience hats, had a condition and we want to join a trial, what is there in Australia to help matchmake? Here's a trial that's in this condition, looking for patients with these sorts of features, and you could sort of cut out the middleman, the clinician, and go straight to the trial. And there is a little bit of that in Australia, but it's not great, I would say. And then you're asking for an added complexity, which is there any database where you could almost matchmake the two trials? And there's synergies between your trial and my trial. Let's get together.
Rather than funding a trial from scratch, there could be another trial going on somewhere that the design would allow you, say, to collect some extra samples that might answer a study question that you've interested in or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's part of the intention of registration early on the Australian New Zealand register, but also clinicaltrials.gov, that you can go there. But many trials don't get registered on those databases at all, let alone early enough to facilitate what you're talking about. There is an opportunity with sponsored studies, though, to have investigator add-ons, and I and many others around the room taken that advantage, where companies are often very happy for an add-on to be used. So if you have a particular assay or a particular intervention that isn't going to interfere with the basic design of the study, the companies are usually very happy to have those participants accessed for another purpose, because it all benefits the public good. So that's another way to do it. And I think, certainly some of Lucas's centres, I think there's been some add-ons, local add-ons to some international studies, which are an important way to do that. So look, we're at time. Thank you very much, firstly, to the panellists, Lucas especially, from dialing in from a conference. Covered a lot of territory again, thanks to those in the room and those online. For those in the room, there's refreshments outside. Lucas, I'll have to buy you a drink next time we meet.
Thank you.
To compensate, but again, thanks very much, and we look forward to your participation in future HTQ events. Thanks.
Thanks very much.